The brass clock in the entrance hall of Riverside Manor struck 6 in the evening on July 4th, 1851. Its chimes barely audible over the screaming. By the time the final note faded into the thick Tennessee air, 17 people lay dying on the polished hardwood floors of the grand ballroom, their bodies convulsing in ways that defied the elegant surroundings. Crystal punch bowls had shattered against marble mantels. The carefully arranged platters of roasted meats and summer vegetables sat abandoned on tables draped in patriotic bunting. Outside, fireworks purchased from a New Orleans supplier waited in wooden crates, destined never to illuminate the Memphis sky. The Independence Day celebration at Riverside Manor had become a tomb before the sun had fully set. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What made the scene even more disturbing was the selectivity of the carnage. Every white guest who had partaken of the evening meal suffered the same fate, their faces drained of color, their limbs trembling uncontrollably, their eyes wide with the terror of understanding that something irreversible was happening inside their bodies. Yet the house servants who had prepared and served the food moved through the chaos untouched, their expressions a careful mixture of horror and something else, something that observers would later struggle to name. The cook's daughter, an 11-year-old girl named Lucy, stood perfectly still in the doorway between the service corridor and the ballroom, watching the destruction unfold with eyes that reflected the candlelight, but revealed nothing of what thoughts moved behind them. The Thornton family had ruled over 300 acres of prime cotton land along the Mississippi River for 2 generations. Their home, a Greek Revival masterpiece with towering white columns and wraparound galleries, represented everything the antebellum South aspired to be: gracious, prosperous, untouchable. Master William Thornton prided himself on running what he called a civilized establishment. He provided adequate rations to his slaves, rarely used the whip except when absolutely necessary for discipline, and even allowed his house servants to learn basic reading so they could follow written instructions. By the standards of 1851 Tennessee, he considered himself a benevolent master. His slaves, had anyone bothered to ask them, might have used different words. The heat that summer had been relentless, even by Memphis standards. The kind of oppressive humidity that made breathing feel like drowning, that turned cotton clothing into a second skin of sweat-soaked fabric clinging to bodies already exhausted from labor. The Mississippi River, usually a source of cooling breezes, seemed to radiate its own heat back toward the land, creating a shimmering haze that distorted distances and made the mind play tricks. In the detached kitchen building, behind the main house, where cook fires added their own contribution to the inferno, Grace worked 18-hour days preparing meals that grew more elaborate as the 4th of July approached. Grace had been born at Riverside Manor 28 years earlier, the daughter of the previous head cook, who had died when Grace was barely 15. Master Thornton's father had immediately promoted the girl to her mother's position, recognizing that culinary skill ran in the family line. For 13 years, Grace had produced meals that became legendary throughout Memphis society. Her roasted duck with cherry glaze graced the tables of visiting senators. Her lemon cream cakes were requested specifically by the governor's wife. Her ability to transform the simplest ingredients into sophisticated dishes had made Riverside Manor famous for its hospitality. But fame in the kitchen came with a price that could never be calculated in compliments or leftover scraps. Grace's hands bore the scars of 1,000 burns from cast-iron pots and brick ovens. Her back ached constantly from hours spent bent over preparation tables. She had birthed 3 children in the small cabin assigned to her in the quarters, and watched 2 of them sold away before their 5th birthdays, when Master Thornton needed quick cash to cover gambling debts. Only Lucy remained, spared from sale because Master Thornton's wife Beatrice had taken a peculiar interest in keeping mother and daughter together, not from kindness, but from the calculating recognition that a cook who feared losing her last child would work harder, complain less, and never risk the punishments that might lead to separation. Lucy had grown up in the perpetual twilight zone between the slave quarters and the main house. Too young for field work, but old enough to be useful, she spent her days running errands, fetching water, scrubbing pots, and absorbing everything that happened in the kitchen with the silent intensity of a child who had learned that survival depended on understanding the adults around her. She knew which spices her mother reached for instinctively. She could predict when Master Thornton would complain about oversalted soup based on his mood at breakfast. She understood the unspoken language of fear that passed between the house servants whenever Beatrice Thornton inspected their work with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue. The 4th of July celebration had been planned for months. Master Thornton intended to announce his candidacy for state legislature that evening, using the patriotic holiday as a platform to gather Memphis's most influential citizens under his roof. Invitations had gone out to every family of consequence within a day's carriage ride. The guest list read like a directory of Tennessee power: plantation owners whose land stretched for miles, merchants who controlled the river trade, lawyers who shaped state policy, and the religious leaders who provided moral justification for the entire system. 50 guests were expected, though the final count would only reach 43. Not all of them would survive to see the fireworks. Grace had begun preparations a week in advance. The main course would be roasted lamb, a luxury in the summer heat, but deemed necessary for such an important occasion. She had supervised the slaughter personally, selecting the finest animals from Master Thornton's flock. The lamb would be accompanied by new potatoes and butter, fresh green beans from the kitchen garden, cornbread with honey, and her signature blackberry cobbler made from berries picked by the field hands at dawn. But the centerpiece of the meal, the dish that would be served to every guest, without exception, was her famous herb-crusted pork roast, bathed in a rich gravy that required 2 days of careful preparation to achieve the proper depth of flavor.
Mother then refined it over years of experimentation until it became something almost magical. The combination of pan drippings, wine, herbs, and a mysterious blend of spices created a sauce so complex and delicious that guests would invariably request second helpings. Master Thornton took pride in watching visitors try to guess the ingredients, never suspecting that the true secret lay not in what went into the gravy, but in the precise timing and temperature control required to marry the flavors properly. Grace had never written down the recipe. It existed only in her muscle memory and instinct, which made her irreplaceable and gave her the smallest measure of preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Protection in a world where she owned nothing, not even her own body. Lucy had watched her mother make that gravy hundreds of times. She knew the routine so intimately that she could have prepared it in her sleep. First, the careful scraping of the roasting pan to capture every bit of caramelized meat essence. Then the slow addition of red wine, just enough to deglaze without overwhelming the flavor. The incorporation of beef stock that had simmered overnight with bones and vegetables. The bundle of fresh herbs, tied with kitchen string and submerged in the liquid to infuse their essence. The gentle simmer that could never become a boil, maintained for hours until the sauce reduced to exactly the right consistency. And finally, the seasoning adjustments at the end, the pinches of salt and pepper, and the mysterious additions from Grace's personal spice collection that transformed good gravy into something memorable. On the morning of July 4th, Grace had been awake since 3, moving through the pre-dawn darkness by the light of tallow candles. The kitchen building stood separate from the main house, connected by a covered walkway that protected the servers from rain but did nothing to moderate the heat. Inside, the brick oven had been fired before sunrise, its interior temperature carefully controlled to roast the lamb and pork to perfection. Multiple pots bubbled on the cast-iron stove, each one requiring constant attention. The air hung thick with wood smoke, roasting meat, and the sharp tang of herbs being chopped in rapid succession. Lucy arrived just after dawn, as she did every morning, carrying 2 buckets of fresh water from the well. She found her mother already deep into the work, her face glistening with sweat and her hands moving with the mechanical precision of someone who had stopped thinking about individual tasks and simply moved from one to the next. Grace acknowledged her daughter's arrival with a brief nod, then immediately assigned her to shelling peas and peeling potatoes. The pile of vegetables seemed endless, but Lucy worked through them steadily, her small hands moving quickly while her eyes tracked everything else happening in the kitchen. The other house servants came and went throughout the morning, each one bringing news from the main house. Guests were beginning to arrive earlier than expected. Master Thornton was in a particularly foul mood because his dress boots had been inadequately polished. Beatrice Thornton had changed her mind about the table arrangements 3 times, requiring the dining room to be reset each time. The children, James and Abigail, were running wild through the house, despite their governess's attempts to contain them. The usual chaos of a grand entertainment, amplified by the importance Master Thornton placed on this particular gathering. But beneath the surface chaos, something else simmered in the kitchen that morning. Grace's hands shook as she worked, though whether from exhaustion or emotion was impossible to determine. She had been crying earlier, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen, though she refused to discuss why with the other servants who asked. Lucy noticed these details with the hypervigilance of a child whose survival had always depended on reading adult moods. She noticed, too, that her mother kept glancing toward the doorway as if expecting someone, and that she flinched whenever footsteps approached from the main house. The truth behind Grace's distress had emerged 3 days earlier, on July 1st, during a conversation Lucy had overheard while hiding in the root cellar. Master Thornton and his wife had been discussing the household accounts, and Beatrice had made a suggestion that William initially dismissed but then reconsidered. Lucy was growing into a pretty girl, she noted, and there were buyers in New Orleans who paid premium prices for young house servants with potential. The cotton market had been unpredictable that year, and the money from selling Lucy could cover the expenses of William's political campaign, with enough left over to purchase a new carriage. Grace could always have more children after all, and keeping mother and daughter together had been a temporary indulgence anyway. William Thornton had agreed to consider the proposal. His wife's business sense was usually sound, and he needed to make a strong impression with his announcement that evening. A successful political campaign required substantial financial backing, and liquidating some assets made practical sense. He would make his final decision after the 4th of July celebration once he had gauged the level of support from potential donors. But he saw no reason not to arrange for a buyer to inspect Lucy during the party, just to determine what price she might fetch. The New Orleans slave trader Constance Harper would be attending as a guest, and she had an eye for valuable merchandise. Lucy had heard every word through the floor grating of the root cellar. She had remained perfectly silent as the voices moved away, then climbed out and walked directly to the kitchen where her mother was preparing dinner. When Lucy looked up and saw her mother's face, she knew immediately that Lucy had learned something terrible. The conversation that followed was held in whispers, punctuated by Grace's desperate assurances that she would find a way to prevent the sale, that she would work harder, that she would beg Master Thornton for mercy. But both mother and daughter knew that begging accomplished nothing when white people had already made up their minds. What Lucy didn't tell her mother was where she had gone after leaving the kitchen that evening. She had walked alone through the formal gardens at the front of the house, past the roses and lilies that Beatrice Thornton tended with such obsessive care, until she reached a section near the property's chapel where different flowers grew. Foxgloves stood tall on their stalks, their purple blooms nodding in the evening breeze. Monkshood clustered in shaded areas, its deep blue flowers almost black in the fading light. Oleander bushes marked the boundary between cultivated garden and wild growth, their pink and white blossoms cheerful and innocent-looking. Plantation learned quickly which plants could heal and which could kill. The knowledge was passed down through generations, shared in whispered conversations when the white folks weren't listening. Elder Ruth, the oldest slave at Riverside Manor, had taught Lucy about medicinal herbs while they worked together in the kitchen garden. She had explained which roots could ease a fever, which leaves could stop bleeding, and which flowers were so dangerous that even touching them required washing your hands immediately afterward. Ruth's lessons had been motivated by protection and healing, ways to help people who had no access to doctors and whose illnesses were often ignored until they became life-threatening. But the same knowledge that could heal could also harm. Lucy understood this with the clarity of a child whose innocence had been stripped away by circumstances beyond her control. She understood, too, that she was running out of time, that in 3 days her fate might be sealed, and that no amount of begging or pleading would change the fundamental fact that she was property, not a person, in the eyes of the people who controlled her existence. The conversation Lucy had overheard beneath the kitchen porch 2 evenings before the celebration had provided the final piece of information she needed. Elder Ruth and 2 other older women had gathered in their usual spot after the day's work was finished, sitting on overturned buckets and sharing the kind of knowledge that kept their community alive. The topic that night had been the flowers in Beatrice Thornton's garden, and specifically how to avoid accidental poisoning when weeding or pruning near the dangerous species. Elder Ruth's voice had been low and careful that evening, barely rising above the chorus of cicadas that filled the summer darkness. She spoke of foxglove, beautiful and deadly, containing substances that affected the heart's rhythm until it simply stopped beating. She described monkshood, whose roots were so poisonous that even the ancient Greeks had used it to execute criminals. And she lingered longest on the subject of oleander, explaining how every part of the plant carried toxins strong enough to kill a grown man, how even the smoke from burning oleander wood could sicken anyone who breathed it, how livestock that grazed near the bushes sometimes died within hours. The old woman had not been teaching murder. She had been sharing survival knowledge, explaining which plants to avoid when gathering firewood, which flowers the children should never pick, which areas of the garden required extra caution during weeding. Her warnings were intended to protect, not to harm. But Lucy absorbed the information with an intensity that went far beyond simple caution. She memorized every detail, every description of symptoms, every mention of how the poisons worked inside the body. She filed the knowledge away in her mind alongside everything else she had learned about the mechanisms of life and death in a world where both could be taken from her at any moment. The night before the 4th of July, Lucy had left the cabin she shared with her mother and walked alone through the darkness toward the formal gardens. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate by without needing a candle that might draw attention. She moved silently, a skill learned from years of trying to remain invisible in a house where drawing notice often meant punishment. The garden stretched before her, row upon row of carefully cultivated beauty that existed solely for Beatrice Thornton's pleasure and the admiration of guests who strolled through after dinner parties. The foxglove grew in a dedicated bed near the eastern wall, their tall stalks swaying gently in the night breeze. Lucy knelt beside them, her small hands reaching for the lowest blooms. She picked carefully, selecting flowers from different plants so that no single stalk would show obvious damage. The petals felt soft against her fingers, deceptively gentle for something that carried death within its cells. She gathered them into the front of her apron, creating a small pile of purple bells that glowed almost luminescent in the moonlight. The monkshood required more care. The plants grew in shadier sections, their root systems spreading beneath the soil in networks that Ruth had described as particularly concentrated with poison. Lucy used a sharpened stick to dig carefully around one plant, loosening the earth until she could work her fingers underneath and extract several of the smaller lateral roots without disturbing the main plant enough to be noticed. The roots came free with a smell like damp earth and something else, something bitter that made her nose wrinkle. She wrapped them carefully in a scrap of cloth torn from her apron's hem. The oleander presented the easiest harvest.
The bushes grew thick and abundant, their branches heavy with clusters of flowers. Lucy could take entire stems without anyone noticing the loss among such profusion. She broke off several branches, stripping the flowers and some of the leaves, then carefully replanting the broken stems back into the bush so that casual observation would reveal nothing amiss. The milky sap from the broken stems stuck to her hands, and she remembered Ruth's warning about washing thoroughly after any contact with oleander. But washing would come later. First, she needed to complete her collection. By the time Lucy returned to the cabin, her apron bulged with deadly flowers and her hands tingled from contact with the various plant toxins. Grace had been asleep, exhausted from another 18-hour workday, and didn't wake when her daughter slipped inside. Lucy emptied her apron's contents onto the small table near the window where moonlight provided enough illumination to work by. She separated the different plants into distinct piles, then began the process that Ruth's warnings had inadvertently taught her. The foxglove flowers needed to be dried slightly to concentrate their potency. Lucy spread them on a clean cloth and placed them in the warmest corner of the cabin, near where the residual heat from the cooking fire seeped through the wall. The monkshood roots required scraping to remove the outer bark and expose the white inner flesh where the poison concentrated most heavily. She used the same sharpened stick she had employed for digging, working carefully to avoid getting the scrapings on her skin. The oleander presented the easiest harvest. The bushes grew thick and abundant, their branches heavy with clusters of flowers. Lucy could take entire stems without anyone noticing the loss among such profusion. She broke off several branches, stripping the flowers and some of the leaves, then carefully replanting the broken stems back into the bush so that casual observation would reveal nothing amiss. The milky sap from the broken stems stuck to her hands, and she remembered Ruth's warning about washing thoroughly after any contact with oleander. But washing would come later. First, she needed to complete her collection.
Separately, creating 3 small piles of prepared material that she wrapped individually in scraps of cloth. The foxglove became a fine powder, purple-tinged and faintly sweet-smelling. The monkshood root scrapings formed a paste when ground with a few drops of water, pale and innocuous-looking. The oleander reduced to a thick pulp, greenish and slightly sticky. As dawn approached, Lucy carefully cleaned her workspace, wiping down the stones and table with water she then poured outside where it would soak into the ground rather than contaminate any drinking supply. She washed her hands repeatedly in the basin, scrubbing until her skin felt raw. The 3 wrapped bundles went into the deep pocket of her work dress, the one she wore every day in the kitchen, where they nestled against her hip like secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. Grace woke at her usual time, just before sunrise, and found Lucy already dressed and waiting. If she noticed anything unusual about her daughter's appearance or behavior, she gave no sign. The 4th of July demanded all her attention, every bit of focus she could muster. There was no room for worry about anything beyond the immediate challenges of preparing a feast for 50 guests while managing a kitchen staff that consisted of herself, Lucy, and 2 other house servants who would be pulled away constantly for other duties. The morning of July 4th unfolded with the controlled chaos that always preceded major entertainments at Riverside Manor. Grace moved through her tasks with mechanical efficiency, her mind focused entirely on timing and coordination. The lamb went into the oven first, requiring the longest cooking time. The pork roast followed an hour later, its surface rubbed with a crust of herbs and garlic that would caramelize during cooking. Vegetables were cleaned, chopped, and prepared for their final cooking. Bread dough rose in wooden bowls covered with damp cloths. The famous blackberry cobbler waited for its moment, the berries macerated with sugar until they released their juices. But the centerpiece of the meal, the element that required the most careful attention, remained the gravy. Grace had begun its preparation the previous evening, reducing beef stock to concentrate its flavor, preparing the herb bundle that would infuse the sauce, measuring out the wine that would provide depth and complexity. On the morning of the celebration, she would complete the process, transforming individual components into the finished product that guests would praise and request seconds of, never suspecting that their enthusiasm for this particular dish would prove fatal. Lucy watched her mother work with the same intense observation she always brought to the kitchen. She had helped make this gravy dozens of times, knew every step of the process, understood the precise moment when each ingredient needed to be added. She knew, too, the one crucial point in the preparation when Grace would turn away from the gravy pot, her attention demanded by another urgent task, leaving the sauce to simmer unwatched for just a few minutes. That moment came predictably, like clockwork, at the same point in the process every single time. It was when Grace transferred the roasted meat from pans to serving platters, a task that required both hands and complete focus to avoid burning herself or dropping the expensive cuts. The morning passed in a blur of activity. Guests began arriving around noon, their carriages crunching up the long drive lined with oak trees that provided minimal shade from the brutal July sun. The sounds of celebration drifted through the kitchen windows like music from another world. Laughter, conversation, the clink of glasses as toasts were proposed and accepted. Master Thornton's voice booming over the crowd as he greeted each arrival with the jovial backslapping that passed for friendship among wealthy men. Beatrice Thornton's lighter tones directing guests toward refreshments, complimenting the ladies on their dresses, orchestrating the social dance with the skill of someone who understood that power often moved through drawing rooms rather than counting houses. Grace paused once during the afternoon preparations to press her hands against her lower back, trying to ease the constant ache that never fully went away. Lucy saw the gesture and recognized the depth of exhaustion behind it, the toll that years of endless labor had extracted from our mother's body. Grace was only 28, but moved like a woman 20 years older, worn down by work that never ended and conditions that allowed no rest. How much longer could she maintain this pace? And what would happen to Lucy when Grace inevitably collapsed under the weight of demands that no human body could sustain indefinitely? The answers to those questions had been decided 3 days earlier when Lucy overheard the conversation about her sale. Every path forward led to separation and suffering. If Grace continued working herself to death, Lucy would be sold off to recover value from a deceased asset. If Grace faltered in her duties, punishment would follow, possibly including Lucy's sale as motivation for improved performance. If they tried to run, they would be caught and punished in ways that made death seem preferable. The system had been designed to eliminate all options except submission, to create a cage without visible bars that nonetheless trapped its victims as effectively as any prison. But Lucy had found a fourth option, one that existed outside the acceptable parameters of slave behavior. She had found a way to strike back, to transform powerlessness into power, to use the very knowledge that had been shared for protective purposes as a weapon of devastating effectiveness. The bundles in her pocket pressed against her hip like a promise, a guarantee that whatever else happened, she would not go quietly into the life of brutality and exploitation that awaited her in New Orleans. The afternoon wore on, and the time for dinner service approached. Grace assembled the serving platters with artistic precision, arranging food in ways that pleased the eye as well as the palate. The roasted lamb sat on its bed of herbs, glistening with juices that had been carefully basted over hours of cooking. The pork roast had been sliced into perfect medallions, each one showing the proper gradation from caramelized exterior to pink, tender center. Vegetables gleamed with butter, bread steamed from its final moments in the oven, and the blackberry cobbler waited for its topping of fresh cream. But the centerpiece of the meal, the element that required the most careful attention, remained the gravy. Grace had begun its preparation the previous evening, reducing beef stock to concentrate its flavor, preparing the herb bundle that would infuse the sauce, measuring out the wine that would provide depth and complexity. On the morning of the celebration, she would complete the process, transforming individual components into the finished product that guests would praise and request seconds of, never suspecting that their enthusiasm for this particular dish would prove fatal. Lucy watched her mother work with the same intense observation she always brought to the kitchen. She had helped make this gravy dozens of times, knew every step of the process, understood the precise moment when each ingredient needed to be added. She knew, too, the one crucial point in the preparation when Grace would turn away from the gravy pot, her attention demanded by another urgent task, leaving the sauce to simmer unwatched for just a few minutes. That moment came predictably, like clockwork, at the same point in the process every single time. It was when Grace transferred the roasted meat from pans to serving platters, a task that required both hands and complete focus to avoid burning herself or dropping the expensive cuts. The morning passed in a blur of activity. Guests began arriving around noon, their carriages crunching up the long drive lined with oak trees that provided minimal shade from the brutal July sun. The sounds of celebration drifted through the kitchen windows like music from another world. Laughter, conversation, the clink of glasses as toasts were proposed and accepted. Master Thornton's voice booming over the crowd as he greeted each arrival with the jovial backslapping that passed for friendship among wealthy men. Beatrice Thornton's lighter tones directing guests toward refreshments, complimenting the ladies on their dresses, orchestrating the social dance with the skill of someone who understood that power often moved through drawing rooms rather than counting houses. Grace paused once during the afternoon preparations to press her hands against her lower back, trying to ease the constant ache that never fully went away. Lucy saw the gesture and recognized the depth of exhaustion behind it, the toll that years of endless labor had extracted from her mother's body. Grace was only 28, but moved like a woman 20 years older, worn down by work that never ended and conditions that allowed no rest. How much longer could she maintain this pace? And what would happen to Lucy when Grace inevitably collapsed under the weight of demands that no human body could sustain indefinitely? The answers to those questions had been decided 3 days earlier when Lucy overheard the conversation about her sale. Every path forward led to separation and suffering. If Grace continued working herself to death, Lucy would be sold off to recover value from a deceased asset. If Grace faltered in her duties, punishment would follow, possibly including Lucy's sale as motivation for improved performance. Hands were occupied with the carving knife and serving fork. Her focus was entirely on the delicate task of slicing meat properly so that each guest received an equal portion. Lucy moved so quickly that afterwards she couldn't remember making the conscious decision to act. One moment she was standing near the preparation table, the next she was beside the gravy pot, her hand dipping into her pocket and emerging with the 3 wrapped bundles. She untied them with trembling fingers, working by feel rather than sight, and poured their contents into the gently bubbling sauce. The foxglove powder disappeared immediately, dissolving into the brown liquid without trace. The monkshood paste required a moment of stirring to incorporate fully, but it too vanished into the gravy's depths. The oleander pulp was the most visible, floating briefly on the surface before Lucy used the long wooden spoon to fold it thoroughly into the mixture. The entire process took perhaps 30 seconds. By the time Grace turned back toward the stove, Lucy had retreated to her previous position, the empty cloth stuffed back into her pocket, her face carefully composed into the mask of neutrality that all slaves learned to wear when they needed to hide their thoughts. Grace picked up the same wooden spoon that Lucy had just used and gave the gravy one final stir, then nodded with satisfaction. Perfect. The consistency was exactly right, the color deep and rich, the aroma making even her own mouth water despite her exhaustion. The serving of dinner at Riverside Manor followed strict protocols developed over years of entertaining. The most distinguished guests received their plates first, served by Grace herself, with Lucy following behind, carrying additional platters. Master Thornton sat at the head of the main table, Governor Cartwright positioned to his right in the place of honor. Beatrice Thornton presided over the foot of the table, her sharp eyes monitoring every detail of the service. The other guests arranged themselves according to social standing, with the wealthiest plantation owners closest to the hosts and lesser merchants and professionals filling out the remaining seats. Lucy carried a gravy boat filled with the poisoned sauce, moving from guest to guest as they held out their plates for the addition that would complete their meal. She poured carefully, ensuring that each person received a generous portion of the thick brown liquid that Grace had spent 2 days perfecting. Master Thornton received the first serving, accepting it with barely a glance in Lucy's direction. She was furniture to him, a functional object that delivered food and then disappeared from awareness. Governor Cartwright complimented the aroma, earning a pleased smile from Master Thornton. Beatrice Thornton took her portion with a small nod, already engaged in conversation with the woman beside her about some social intrigue in Memphis society. James Thornton, the eldest son, sat with other young men his age at a secondary table, his face already flushed from the whiskey he had been consuming since noon. He had recently returned from university in Virginia, full of ideas about agricultural innovation and political philosophy that he shared loudly with anyone who would listen. His sister Abigail occupied a children's table with several other youngsters, her white dress already stained from enthusiastic eating. At 8 years old, she was still young enough to find joy in simple things like cake and running through gardens. In an hour, she would be dead. Constance Harper sat near the middle of the main table, her expensively dressed figure upright and attentive as she surveyed the room with the practiced eye of someone always evaluating potential merchandise. The New Orleans slave trader had built her fortune on the ability to identify value in human flesh, to see past surface appearance and recognize which slaves would command premium prices in the markets that served the Deep South's most brutal plantations. She had noticed Lucy during the service, studying the girl with an interest that made Grace's hand shake whenever she glimpsed the woman's calculating gaze. The other guests represented a cross-section of Memphis's prosperity and influence. Plantation owners whose combined holdings encompassed tens of thousands of acres, merchants who controlled the flow of cotton from field to ship, lawyers who wrote the contracts that bound the entire system together, a judge whose courtroom had sentenced countless slaves to punishments ranging from whipping to execution, a minister who provided religious justification for slavery from his pulpit every Sunday. Their wives, daughters, and sons filled out the gathering, all of them complicit in and benefiting from a system built on the systematic degradation of human beings. They ate with enthusiasm, praising Grace's cooking between bites and conversations about politics, weather, and the growing tensions with northern states that insisted on interfering with southern institutions. The gravy proved particularly popular, exactly as it always did. Guests used bread to mop up every last drop from their plates, then requested additional servings. Lucy moved among them with the gravy boat, refilling plates on request, ensuring that everyone who wanted more received it. She moved with mechanical precision, her face showing nothing of the knowledge that each spoonful she served carried death. The first symptoms appeared approximately 45 minutes after the initial serving, right at the edge of the timeline Elder Ruth had described during her warnings about accidental poisoning. Foxglove affected the heart, slowing its rhythm and weakening its contractions. Monkshood attacked the nervous system, causing numbness that spread from the extremities inward. Oleander combined the effects of both, creating a toxic cascade that overwhelmed the body's ability to compensate. The three poisons together, in the doses Lucy had prepared, created a combination that medical science in 1851 had no ability to counteract. Governor Cartwright was the first to show visible signs of distress. He had been speaking animatedly about state politics when his words suddenly slurred, trailing off mid-sentence as he pressed one hand against his chest. The expression on his face shifted from animated engagement to confusion, then rapidly to fear as he felt his heart skip and stutter in ways that signaled something fundamentally wrong. He tried to stand, perhaps thinking fresh air might help, but his legs refused to support his weight properly. The numbness had begun its work, spreading through his limbs and rendering them increasingly unresponsive to commands from his brain. Master Thornton noticed his guest's distress and half rose from his own seat, concern written across his features. But before he could speak, his own symptoms manifested with sudden intensity. The room tilted around him, his vision blurring at the edges as his blood pressure dropped precipitously.
He gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white with effort, fighting against the sensation that he was falling, even though he remained in his chair. Beside him, 3 other guests were experiencing similar difficulties, their faces draining of color as the poison disrupted normal cardiovascular function. Beatrice Thornton's sharp intake of breath cut through the growing murmur of concern. She, too, had begun to feel the effects, though her symptoms manifested differently, her hands trembling uncontrollably and her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. She looked toward her husband, seeking explanation or reassurance, but found him equally incapacitated. Her gaze swung toward the kitchen, toward Grace, who stood frozen in the doorway, and in that moment, understanding flickered across her face. The food. Something in the food. The ballroom erupted into chaos as more guests succumbed to the poison's effects. Chairs scraped against hardwood floors as people tried to stand and found their legs uncooperative. Conversations dissolved into exclamations of alarm and cries for help. Several guests made it to their feet only to collapse moments later, their bodies no longer responding to their commands. The sounds of retching mixed with moans of pain as digestive systems rebelled against the toxins coursing through veins and arteries. James Thornton vomited onto the fine Persian rug his father had imported from Constantinople, his young body fighting desperately to expel the poison, but finding the effort futile. The toxins had already been absorbed into his bloodstream, carried to every organ and tissue, beginning their work of systematic shutdown. At the children's table, Abigail began to cry, not from her own symptoms yet, but from the terror of watching adults around her collapse and suffer in ways she had no framework to understand. Dr. Harold Watkins, the family physician who had been enjoying his meal moments earlier, struggled to maintain professional composure even as his own body betrayed him. His medical training told him they were dealing with poisoning, the rapid onset and uniform symptoms across multiple victims making that diagnosis inescapable. But identifying the problem did nothing to solve it. He had no antidotes in his medical bag, no treatments that could reverse what was already happening inside 43 bodies simultaneously. He tried to call out instructions, to organize some kind of response, but his words came out garbled and indistinct as the neurological effects of monkshood affected his ability to speak. Grace stood absolutely still, her mind unable to process what she was witnessing. She had prepared this meal exactly as she had prepared hundreds of others. She had used the same ingredients, followed the same procedures, applied the same careful attention to detail that had made her reputation. The only difference was Lucy's increased presence in the kitchen, but children helped all the time without causing mass casualties. How could this be happening? What had gone wrong? Lucy remained near the service entrance, positioned where she could observe everything while remaining largely unnoticed in the chaos. Her expression showed none of the horror that marked every other face in the room. Instead, she watched with clinical detachment, noting which guests showed symptoms first, whose bodies fought hardest against the poison, who succumbed quickly, and who struggled longer. She was documenting her experiment, observing its results with the same careful attention she had brought to its preparation. Sheriff Daniel Pritchard had been seated near the center of the main table, enjoying what he had anticipated would be a pleasant evening of good food and useful political connections. Now he found himself fighting for breath, his heart racing irregularly in his chest while his hands and feet went numb. He understood, through the fog of his own symptoms, that a crime had been committed here, that someone had deliberately poisoned an entire gathering of Memphis's elite.
His law enforcement instincts screamed at him to take action, to identify the perpetrator, to secure the scene. But his body refused to cooperate, leaving him as helpless as every other victim in the room. The suffering intensified as the poison reached peak concentration in bloodstreams throughout the ballroom. Governor Cartwright's heart, weakened by decades of rich living and the sudden assault of cardiac glycosides, finally gave out entirely. He slumped forward onto the table, his face landing in the remains of his meal, dead before his body finished falling. Master William Thornton watched his honored guest die, tried to call for help, and found himself unable to form coherent words. The paralysis was spreading, affecting not just his limbs, but his ability to speak, to swallow, to perform any of the automatic functions that sustain life. Beatrice Thornton's last conscious thought was of her garden, the beautiful flower she had cultivated with such care, never realizing that her obsession with deadly ornamental plants had provided the means for her own destruction. She died reaching toward her husband, her fingers just brushing his sleeve, before the life left her body entirely. Around the room, similar scenes played out in variations that differed in details, but shared the same horrific conclusion. Bodies slumped in chairs, collapsed onto floors, or lay draped across tables where celebration had turned to catastrophe in the span of an hour. The house servants who had not eaten the poisoned meal moved through the ballroom in stunned silence, trying to help but having no idea what to do. Some attempted to give water to the suffering, not realizing that hydration would only spread the poison more efficiently through already compromised systems. Others ran for help, though help from where remained unclear. The nearest doctor, besides Watkins, was 8 miles away in Memphis proper, and by the time anyone could summon him, every victim would be long dead. The silence that settled over Riverside Manor after the screaming stopped felt heavier than the oppressive July heat. 17 bodies lay scattered throughout the ballroom in positions that defied the dignity their occupants had prized so highly in life. Governor Cartwright remained slumped over the dining table, his expensive silk vestment stained with the food he had praised so enthusiastically an hour ago. Master William Thornton sat rigid in his chair, eyes fixed open in an expression of comprehension that had come far too late to save him. The surviving house servants moved through the carnage with the careful steps of people walking through a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. Isaac, the stable hand who had been called in to help serve drinks, stood near the doorway with tears streaming down his face. Little Abigail Thornton lay near the children's table, her white dress fanned around her like angel wings. She had been the last to die, her smaller body fighting longer against the toxins, giving her more time to
experience terror and confusion before the final shutdown. Grace remained frozen in the kitchen doorway, her mind unable to reconcile what her eyes showed her with any rational explanation. 2 days of careful preparation had produced this incomprehensible result. Her life's work had somehow transformed into an instrument of mass death. The implications crashed over her in waves. She would be blamed. Of course she would be blamed. Her gaze found Lucy among the chaos, and for a brief moment their eyes met. Grace saw something in her daughter's face that made her blood run cold, despite the summer heat. Not horror, not confusion. Instead, Lucy's expression held a calm satisfaction, the look of someone who had planned something carefully and watched it unfold exactly as predicted. Grace's mind rejected what her instincts screamed at her, but memories surfaced that she had previously dismissed as insignificant. The sound of hoofbeats approaching at speed shattered the terrible stillness. Someone had managed to send word to Memphis. Grace knew with absolute certainty that once they arrived, her life would be measured in days at most. There would be no trial worthy of the name, no careful examination of evidence, no possibility of proving innocence when guilt appeared so obvious. Lucy moved toward her mother with deliberate steps, navigating around bodies without looking down at them.
When she reached Grace's side, she took her mother's hand with fingers that felt unnaturally cold despite the heat. Grace looked down at her daughter, searching that young face for some explanation. But Lucy spoke first, her voice so quiet that only her mother could hear. "I did it for us." The simple statement carried such weight that Grace physically staggered. For us? As if mass murder could be justified as an act of protection. The riders burst into the property with controlled chaos. Deputy Marshal Thomas Crawford led the group, having received a garbled message about mass death at Riverside Manor. The scene that greeted him in the ballroom exceeded anything his imagination could have prepared him for. Bodies everywhere, the smell of death already beginning to assert itself in the humid air. Crawford's eyes found Grace immediately. Every lawman in Memphis knew about the legendary cook at Riverside Manor. She stood in the kitchen doorway holding a young girl, both of them clearly alive and unaffected by whatever had killed everyone else. The conclusion seemed inescapable. The cook had poisoned her masters and their guests. The interrogation began immediately. Crawford asked about the meal preparation, the ingredients used, whether anyone had helped with cooking. Grace answered each question mechanically, describing the same process she had followed hundreds of times, finding no explanation for how her carefully prepared feast had become poisonous. Lucy remained silent throughout, pressed against her mother's side, her face carefully blank. Crawford barely glanced at the child, seeing only what everyone saw when they looked at slave children, potential future labor, not a person capable of independent action or complex thought. His questions focused entirely on Grace, building a case that seemed increasingly damning with each answer. Old Ruth mentioned seeing Lucy near the gravy pot at one point, but Crawford dismissed this information as irrelevant. What could a child have possibly contributed to such wholesale destruction? The idea was absurd on its face. Grace was placed under arrest that evening, her hands bound with rope. Lucy clung to her mother, pleading to stay together, creating a scene that made several of the hardened lawmen look away in discomfort. But there was no question of keeping mother and daughter together. Grace would be held in the Memphis jail pending trial, while Lucy would be returned to the slave quarters at Riverside Manor. The separation was handled with casual brutality. Grace was loaded into a wagon for transport to town, her last view of Riverside Manor showing Lucy standing small and alone in the gathering darkness. The child's face remained expressionless. She watched her mother disappear down the long drive, then turned and walked calmly back toward the quarters. The news of the Riverside Manor massacre spread through Memphis and the surrounding region with the speed of wildfire. By the following morning, every household within 50 miles knew the basic facts. Mass poisoning at a 4th of July celebration, 17 dead, including the governor, and the Thornton family cook arrested for the crime. The white community's reaction combined shock, horror, and a fear that cut deeper than either emotion alone. If a trusted slave cook could commit such an act, what did that say about the security of every plantation household? The comfortable fiction that enslaved people accepted their condition crumbled in the face of evidence that someone had planned and executed wholesale slaughter. Plantation families throughout the region responded by implementing new security measures. Food tasters were hired, kitchen access was restricted. Some families stopped eating food prepared by their slaves entirely. The economic impact proved substantial as property values declined and insurance companies refused to write policies covering death by slave action. Several prominent Memphis families abandoned their properties altogether, relocating to cities where they felt safer from the invisible threat that now haunted every meal. The enslaved community's reaction was more complex and carefully hidden from white observation. In the quarters across Tennessee, people gathered after dark to discuss what had happened in voices kept low. Some expressed horror at the deaths, particularly of the children. Others pointed out that those children would have grown into adults who perpetuated the same system. Underneath the debate ran a current of something that had been in short supply for generations: hope. Lucy remained at Riverside Manor in the days following her mother's arrest, living in the cabin she had shared with Grace and working in the kitchen under new supervision. She performed her duties with mechanical efficiency, speaking only when necessary, her face maintaining careful neutrality. The other slaves watched her with a mixture of pity and unease. Most saw only a child who had lost her mother to terrible injustice. But a few noticed things that troubled them. The way Lucy never cried, never showed the grief that should overwhelm a child in her circumstances. The way she seemed to be waiting for something rather than mourning what had been lost: herself. Ruth spoke of grief and loss, of the unfairness of a world that punished the innocent. She talked about Grace's strength and skill, about how proud Lucy should be to have such a mother. Lucy listened without responding, her attention apparently focused on the oleander bushes swaying in the breeze. When Ruth finally fell silent, Lucy turned to look at her with eyes that held no tears and too much knowledge. Then she asked a question that made Ruth's blood run cold. If someone wanted to learn more about poisonous plants, where might they find such information?
Slaves whispered about Lucy's apparent coldness, her failure to show proper grief. But they attributed this to trauma rather than calculated self-preservation. They convinced themselves that the child was simply too overwhelmed to process what was happening, that her emotions had shut down as a protective mechanism against unbearable pain. The night before the execution, Elder Ruth found Lucy sitting alone behind the kitchen building, staring up at stars that provided the only beauty in an otherwise unbearable existence. The old woman sat down beside her without invitation, the weight of her own moral complicity heavy on her conscience. She had figured out what Lucy had done, had chosen silence over revealing the truth, and now had to live with the knowledge that an innocent woman would die because of that choice. Ruth spoke quietly, telling Lucy that she knew, that she understood what had really happened in the kitchen on July 4th. She explained that she hadn't told anyone because she couldn't bring herself to condemn a child, even one capable of such terrible acts. But she needed Lucy to understand the weight of what she had done, the lives she had taken, the innocence she had destroyed in service of survival. She spoke of the children who had died, of James Thornton who had sometimes shown kindness, of the house servants who now lived in constant fear that they too might be suspected of harboring murderous intentions. Lucy listened without responding, her face tilted up toward the stars as though measuring the distance between earth and heaven, calculating whether souls actually traveled that far or simply dissolved into nothingness. When the old woman finally fell silent, Lucy turned to look at her with eyes that reflected starlight but revealed nothing beneath. She spoke in a voice that carried no emotion whatsoever. Sometimes people have to die so others can live. Her mother's death would ensure Lucy's survival, would eliminate the one witness who might eventually reveal the truth, would complete a transformation that had begun the moment she overheard the conversation about her impending sale. Ruth felt tears running down her weathered cheeks as she looked at this child who had learned cruelty's lessons so thoroughly that she could contemplate her own mother's execution without visible remorse. She wanted to argue, to explain why such thinking was monstrous, to somehow reach whatever humanity remained beneath Lucy's carefully constructed shell. But the words wouldn't come, blocked by the recognition that Lucy was right in the most terrible way possible. In a system built on treating human beings as property, survival often required becoming the monster that circumstances demanded. The real crime was not Lucy's response to oppression, but the oppression itself that had created someone capable of such calculated violence. The old woman stood up slowly, her joints protesting the movement after sitting too long on hard ground. She walked away without looking back, leaving Lucy alone with the stars and her secrets. Tomorrow, Grace would die,
and Lucy would begin a new phase of existence unencumbered by witnesses or maternal protection. What that existence would look like, what other acts Lucy might commit in service of her survival, remained unknown. But Ruth understood with certainty that the 4th of July massacre at Riverside Manor had created something unprecedented. A child who had learned that knowledge and determination could overcome vast disparities in power, and who would carry that lesson forward into whatever future awaited her in a world that viewed her as property rather than person. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.